They thought she was just another religious fanatic, clutching her worn leather Bible in the sterile corridors of the Pentagon. Security guards rolled their eyes. Officials whispered behind closed doors, and even the janitor shook his head as she sat there hour after hour, insisting she had critical information for national security. What they didn't know was that tucked between the pages of Psalms and Proverbs were handwritten codes that could either save America or destroy it completely. And when the Secretary of Defense finally walked into that waiting room, everything everyone thought they knew about faith secrets and the most unlikely heroes would change forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Pentagon's visitor center buzzed like angry wasps as Margaret Chen shifted in the uncomfortable plastic chair. Her weathered hands gripped the black leather Bible that had belonged to her late husband, Colonel David Chen, and I could see the way her knuckles had gone white from holding it so tightly for the past 3 hours. The receptionist, a stern woman named Janet with perfectly styled gray hair and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain, had been shooting disapproving glances in Margaret's direction since she'd first walked through the metal detectors that morning. Margaret looked exactly like what she was, a 72-year-old widow from small-town Kansas who'd driven 14 hours straight to Washington, D.C. in her aging Honda Civic. Her floral print dress was wrinkled from the long journey, her silver hair was slightly disheveled, and she clutched that Bible like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. To everyone in that sterile government building, she was just another grieving military spouse who'd lost touch with reality after losing her husband. What made it worse was how she spoke. Margaret had a soft, trembling voice that cracked when she got nervous, and she kept referencing scripture and divine providence whenever anyone asked her questions. The security guard, a burly man named Rodriguez who'd been working Pentagon security for 8 years, had already made 3 jokes about holy rollers to his colleague when he thought Margaret couldn't hear. The waiting room was filled with the usual mix of contractors, military personnel, and government officials, all of whom gave Margaret the kind of wide berth you'd give someone talking to themselves on a subway platform. Janet finally looked up from her computer screen with the expression of someone who'd reached the absolute limit of her patience. "Ma'am, I've told you 3 times already that Secretary Morrison doesn't take walk-in appointments. If you don't have scheduled business here, I'm going to have to ask security to escort you out." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing access to powerful people, and she clearly wasn't impressed by elderly women with Bibles and wild stories about national security. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the Bible to a page somewhere in the middle, her finger tracing along what looked like underlined passages. "Please, just 5 minutes with someone who understands nuclear protocol. My husband spent 30 years in Missile Command, and before he passed, he told me there were things hidden in plain sight that only I would know how to find." Her voice grew smaller with each word, as if she was shrinking under the weight of disbelief surrounding her. Janet's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Lady, this is the Pentagon, not a church counseling session. Your husband's Bible stories aren't going to get you a meeting with the Secretary of Defense." She turned back to her computer screen, fingers clicking aggressively across the keyboard as if Margaret had already ceased to exist. But Margaret didn't leave. She simply sat back down in that plastic chair and reopened the Bible, this time to what appeared to be the Book of Revelation. I watched as she pulled out a small magnifying glass from her purse and began examining the margins of the pages with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was reading something far more complex than scripture. The overhead lights caught the lens, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the worn pages. Rodriguez, the security guard, was getting restless. He'd been standing by the metal detectors for his entire shift, and Margaret was becoming what he considered a disruption to the normal flow of business. "Ma'am, you can't camp out here all day reading your Bible. This is a government facility, not a library." His tone was firm but not unkind, the voice of someone who'd had to remove confused elderly visitors before. Margaret looked up at him with eyes that held a clarity that seemed at odds with everyone's perception of her. "Officer, what if I told you that my husband developed backup contingency codes for the Minuteman III missile system, and that he hid them in a place where only someone who truly knew him would think to look?" She held up the Bible, her finger pointing to what looked like random markings in the margins. Rodriguez exchanged a look with Janet, and I could see them both fighting back smiles. The idea that nuclear launch codes could be hidden in a Bible seemed like something out of a conspiracy theory movie, not reality. Ma'am, with all due respect, that's not how national security works. Those kinds of codes don't get hidden in personal belongings. What they didn't understand was that Colonel David Chen had been one of the most paranoid and brilliant men to ever work in U.S. Missile Command. He'd served during the height of the Cold War, when the threat of nuclear attack kept entire generations awake at night, and he developed contingency plans for contingency plans. Margaret had lived with his obsessive attention to security for 47 years of marriage, watching him create backup systems for everything from their home alarm to their bank accounts. The Bible had been David's most prized possession, inherited from his own father who'd served in World War II. It was a 1952 edition of the King James Version, bound in genuine leather that had aged to a deep brown color. The pages were thin as tissue paper, filled with David's handwritten notes, underlined passages, and what looked like random numbers scattered throughout the margins. To most people, it appeared to be the devotional scribblings of a religious man. To Margaret, who'd watched her husband work late into the night with cryptographic manuals spread across their kitchen table, those numbers told a different story. Janet was growing more agitated by the minute. She'd fielded calls from 3 different departments asking why there was an elderly woman causing a scene in the visitor center, and her supervisor had already warned her about maintaining appropriate decorum in the building. Mrs. What did you say your name was again? Chen. Margaret Chen. My husband was Colonel David Chen, Strategic Air Command, Malmstrom Air Force Base. Margaret's voice grew stronger when she spoke her husband's name and title, as if drawing strength from his memory. Well, Mrs. Chen, I'm going to need you to either schedule a proper appointment through the appropriate channels or leave the premises. You can't just show up here with a Bible and expect to meet with senior defense officials. Janet's patience had officially run out, and she was already reaching for her phone to call for additional security assistance. That's when Margaret did something that caught everyone off guard. She stood up slowly, walked directly to Janet's desk, and opened the Bible to a specific page. She pointed to a series of numbers that had been written in pencil along the margins of Psalm chapter 91, numbers that at first glance looked like verse references or page notations. Tell me, Janet, what do you see when you look at these numbers? Janet glanced down reluctantly, clearly annoyed at being drawn into what she considered an elderly woman's delusion. I see random numbers written in a Bible. Probably verse references or something. Her tone suggested she thought this was a waste of everyone's time. Margaret smiled sadly and shook her head. Those aren't verse references. They're launch authentication codes for the LGM-30G Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile system. Specifically, they're backup verification sequences that my husband developed in case the primary command structure was compromised during a nuclear event. She pointed to another set of numbers near the bottom of the page. And these are targeting coordinates for major Soviet cities circa 1983, when my husband was part of the team that updated America's nuclear response protocols. The waiting room had gone completely quiet. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed louder in the sudden silence. Rodriguez had stopped his casual patrol and was now standing directly behind Janet's chair, staring at the open Bible with an expression that had shifted from amusement to concern. Janet's voice was less certain now, though she was still clearly skeptical. Ma'am, even if that were true, which I'm not saying it is, why would your husband hide that kind of information in a Bible? That seems like exactly the kind of place someone wouldn't put classified material. Margaret closed the Bible gently and looked directly at Janet with the patience of someone who'd spent decades explaining her husband's unique way of thinking. Because David always said that the best hiding place for secrets was somewhere so obvious that no one would ever think to look, he used to tell me, Margaret, if you want to hide a tree, put it in a forest. If you want to hide classified information, put it in the one book that every American household has but nobody really reads carefully. She opened the Bible again, this time to a different section, and pulled out what appeared to be a small piece of paper that had been carefully taped to the inside back cover. The paper was covered in David's meticulous handwriting, but instead of scripture verses, it contained what looked like technical diagrams and numerical sequences. David spent the last 5 years of his life updating these codes, making sure they remained current with modern systems. He knew that if something ever happened to the primary command structure, If there was ever a scenario where normal channels of communication were compromised, someone would need access to these backup protocols. Rodriguez was now leaning over Janet's shoulder, studying the paper with growing interest. His demeanor had shifted completely from dismissive security guard to someone who was beginning to understand that this might be more serious than anyone had initially realized. "Ma'am, you're saying your husband was authorized to create independent backup launch codes?" Margaret nodded slowly. David was part of a classified program called Operation Sanctuary. It was designed during the Reagan administration to create redundant command structures in case of a decapitation strike against U.S. leadership. Only 12 officers were selected for the program, and they were each assigned to develop independent verification systems that could be used to authenticate nuclear response orders if normal command structures were destroyed. She turned to another page in the Bible, this one containing what looked like a hand-drawn map with various locations marked in red ink. These are the locations of hardened communication bunkers that were established as part of Operation Sanctuary. Most of them are still operational, hidden beneath what appear to be civilian structures across the American Midwest. Janet was no longer typing on her computer. Her hands had fallen away from the keyboard, and she was staring at Margaret with an expression that suggested her worldview was being systematically dismantled. "Mrs. Chen, if what you're saying is true, why are you bringing this information here now? Why not 5 years ago when your husband was still alive?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Because David made me promise not to reveal any of this unless there was a clear and present danger to American national security. He said that as long as the normal systems were functioning properly, these backup protocols should remain hidden. But 3 weeks ago, I received a phone call from someone claiming to be with the Department of Defense, asking very specific questions about David's work and whether he'd left behind any documentation." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with her own handwriting. "I started receiving these calls every few days. The caller knew details about David's military service that weren't in any public records. They knew about Operation Sanctuary, they knew about the backup protocols, and they specifically asked whether David had hidden any information and personal belongings that I might have access to." Rodriguez and Janet exchanged a look that suggested they were both beginning to understand that this situation might be far more serious than either of them had initially assumed. The casual dismissal and jokes about religious fanatics had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense that they were dealing with something that was genuinely beyond their level of authority. Janet's voice was much quieter now, almost hesitant. "Mrs. Chen, did you tell these callers anything about the Bible or the information your husband left behind?" Margaret shook her head firmly. "I told them I didn't know anything about my husband's classified work, which was partially true. David never discussed operational details with me while he was alive. It was only after his death, when I was going through his personal effects, that I discovered what he'd hidden in this Bible." She held up the book again, but the calls kept coming, and the questions kept getting more specific. The last caller knew about the Bible specifically. They asked whether David had left me any religious materials that might contain, quote, "unusual annotations or markings." The implications of what Margaret was saying were starting to sink in for everyone in the room. If someone outside the legitimate government structure knew about Operation Sanctuary and was actively trying to locate backup nuclear protocols, that represented a potential security breach of unprecedented magnitude. Rodriguez had pulled out his radio and was speaking quietly into it, though I could hear him requesting immediate contact with the duty officer for the Pentagon Security Division. His casual demeanor had been replaced by the focused intensity of someone who realized he might be dealing with a genuine security threat. Janet was now looking at Margaret with completely different eyes. The dismissive bureaucrat had been replaced by someone who understood that she might be the first point of contact for what could be a major national security incident. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to stay exactly where you are. I'm going to make some phone calls, and I think we're going to need to get some people down here who are qualified to evaluate what you've brought us." Margaret nodded and settled back into her plastic chair, clutching the Bible against her chest. For the first time since she'd arrived at the Pentagon that morning, she looked relieved rather than frustrated. Someone was finally taking her seriously, and the burden of carrying her husband's secrets alone was beginning to lift from her shoulders. But what none of them knew was that Margaret's phone had been ringing in her hotel room for the past hour, and the same voice that had been calling her at home in Kansas was now asking very specific questions about her current location and whether she'd made contact with anyone at the Pentagon. The race to secure or steal America's most sensitive nuclear protocols was just beginning, and Margaret Chen, with her worn leather Bible and trembling hands, was sitting at the center of what could become the most dangerous security breach in U.S. military history. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and the atmosphere in the Pentagon Visitor Center changed instantly. Secretary of Defense William Morrison stepped out, flanked by two men in dark suits, who moved with the precise coordination of presidential security detail. Morrison was tall, gray-haired, and carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected millions of lives. His blue eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency, taking in Janet's nervous posture, Rodriguez's radio still crackling with urgent communications, and Margaret Chen sitting quietly with her Bible. What happened next sent shockwaves through everyone present. Morrison walked directly to Margaret, stopped 3 feet in front of her chair, and rendered a sharp military salute. His voice carried clearly across the silent room when he spoke. "Mrs. Chen, I served under your husband in Strategic Air Command from 1979 to 1983. Colonel David Chen was one of the finest officers and most brilliant strategic minds I ever had the privilege to work with." Margaret's eyes widened with recognition and surprise. She struggled to her feet, her hands still clutching the Bible, and returned a respectful nod. "Secretary Morrison, David spoke of you often. He said you were one of the few people who truly understood the importance of redundant security protocols." Janet's mouth fell open. Rodriguez stopped mid-transmission on his radio. The casual dismissal, the jokes, the assumption that Margaret was just another confused elderly woman, all of it crumbled in the face of the Secretary of Defense, treating her with the respect due to the widow of a decorated colonel. Morrison's expression grew serious as he gestured toward the Bible in Margaret's hands. "Mrs. Chen, I received an urgent briefing 20 minutes ago suggesting that you might have information related to Operation Sanctuary. I want you to know that what your husband created as part of that program potentially represents one of our most critical national security assets." Margaret nodded slowly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Secretary Morrison, I believe there are people actively trying to obtain the protocols David developed. I've been receiving phone calls for weeks from someone who knows far too much about classified operations." One of the men in dark suits stepped forward and spoke quietly to Morrison. I could see Margaret studying him carefully, her expression growing concerned. Morrison nodded and turned back to Margaret. "Mrs. Chen, we're going to need to move this conversation to a secure location immediately. Agent Williams here tells me that we've detected unusual electronic surveillance activity in this area over the past several hours." Margaret's face went pale. "They've been watching me?" Morrison's expression was grim. "It's possible. Mrs. Chen, Operation Sanctuary was designed to be completely compartmentalized. The fact that unknown parties are asking specific questions about your husband's work suggests either a significant intelligence breach or the involvement of someone with access to classified historical records." Janet had been standing behind her desk in stunned silence. But now she found her voice. "Secretary Morrison, I owe Mrs. Chen an apology. I treated her like she was delusional when she arrived this morning. I had no idea." Morrison held up a hand, his tone professional but not unkind. "Janet, you followed proper protocols for handling unscheduled visitors. Mrs. Chen's situation is unprecedented, and there was no way for you to know the significance of what she was carrying." He turned back to Margaret. "However, Mrs. Chen, I need you to understand that from this moment forward, you're under the protection of the United States government. The information you possess is too sensitive to leave unguarded." Margaret clutched the Bible tighter against her chest. "Secretary Morrison, David made me promise that these protocols would only be revealed if there was a clear threat to national security. The phone calls have convinced me that such a threat exists. But I need to be certain that the information goes to the right people. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Morrison nodded with understanding. "Mrs. Chen, I give you my word as Secretary of Defense and as someone who served with your husband that this information will be handled with the highest level of security and used only to protect American interests." Agent Williams spoke again, this time directly to Margaret. "Ma'am, we've identified at least 3 different phone numbers that have been calling your hotel room in the past 2 hours. None of them trace back to legitimate government agencies. We need to get you to a secure facility immediately." Margaret looked around the visitor center one last time, taking in Jeanette's apologetic expression and Rodriguez's newfound respect. Then she opened the Bible to a page near the front and carefully removed what appeared to be a small microfilm cartridge that had been taped to the inside cover. "Secretary Morrison, this contains the complete Operation Sanctuary protocols, including updated targeting data and authentication sequences that David maintained until his death last year." Morrison accepted the microfilm with the reverence due to a sacred object. "Mrs. Chen, you have no idea how important this could be. We've been operating under the assumption that all Operation Sanctuary materials were destroyed when the program was officially terminated in 1991. Margaret shook her head slowly. "David told me that the official termination was actually a cover story designed to make potential adversaries believe the backup protocols no longer existed. He continued updating and maintaining the systems through unofficial channels, using his veterans' access to military databases and his relationships with active duty personnel." One of Morrison's aides, a young officer with captain's bars, stepped forward with a concerned expression. "Sir, if Colonel Chen continued developing these protocols after official termination, we have no way of knowing whether current command structures are compatible with his authentication systems." Margaret overheard this exchange and opened the Bible to another section, revealing pages of technical diagrams and compatibility matrices. David anticipated that concern. These pages contain integration protocols for connecting his backup systems with every major upgrade to U.S. nuclear command infrastructure from 1991 through 2023. Morrison studied the diagrams with growing amazement. "Mrs. Chen, your husband essentially created a shadow nuclear command system that could function independently of official channels?" Margaret nodded. "David called it the last resort option. He said that if America ever faced a scenario where normal command structures were compromised, whether by enemy action, cyber attack, or internal betrayal, these protocols could ensure that our nuclear deterrent remained credible and under legitimate control." Agent Williams received an urgent communication through his earpiece and immediately stepped closer to Morrison. "Sir, we have a problem. Intelligence indicates that at least 2 foreign intelligence services have been actively searching for Operation Sanctuary materials. The calls to Mrs. Chen may have been part of a coordinated effort to locate and acquire these protocols. The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. If hostile foreign powers gained access to backup nuclear command protocols, they could potentially manipulate or disable America's nuclear deterrent capabilities." The elderly woman with the Bible, who'd been laughed at and dismissed just hours earlier, was carrying information that could determine the balance of global power. Morrison's voice took on the urgency of someone dealing with a potential national crisis. "Mrs. Chen, we need to verify the authenticity and current relevance of these protocols immediately. Are you willing to work with our technical teams to ensure that your husband's systems can be properly integrated with current security measures?" Margaret squared her shoulders with a determination that reminded everyone present that she'd been married to a career military officer for nearly 5 decades. "Secretary Morrison, David spent the last years of his life preparing me for this moment. He taught me how to read his technical notations, how to verify authentication sequences, and how to identify potential security vulnerabilities in the protocols." She opened the Bible to a section near the back and revealed what appeared to be a detailed checklist written in David's precise handwriting. David created a step-by-step verification process that would allow authorized personnel to confirm the legitimacy of the protocols and test their compatibility with current systems. Morrison examined the checklist with growing respect for Colonel Chen's foresight and planning. "Mrs. Chen, this level of preparation suggests that your husband anticipated not just the possibility of a national crisis, but also the specific challenges involved in transferring these protocols to current leadership." Janet, who had been listening to this exchange with increasing amazement, finally found the courage to speak. "Mrs. Chen, I want to apologize again for how I treated you this morning. I had no idea that you were carrying information this important." Margaret turned to Janet with a gentle smile that held no trace of resentment or anger. "Janet, you were doing your job, and you had no way of knowing what David had hidden in this Bible. In fact, your initial skepticism was probably exactly the kind of response David hoped these protocols would receive from unauthorized personnel. Rodriguez stepped forward, his earlier dismissive attitude completely transformed. "Ma'am, when you first arrived this morning and told me about nuclear codes hidden in a Bible, I thought it was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. I owe you a sincere apology." Margaret nodded graciously. "Officer Rodriguez, David always said that the best security systems were the ones that seemed impossible or ridiculous to people who didn't have the proper context. Your reaction was perfectly normal, and exactly what David intended." Morrison was studying the technical diagrams in the Bible with increasing concentration. "Mrs. Chen, these integration protocols appear to address vulnerabilities in our current command structure that we weren't even aware existed. Your husband identified potential failure points that our current security assessments have missed." Margaret's expression grew serious. David was obsessed with the possibility that America's nuclear command systems could be compromised through cyber attack or insider betrayal. He spent years developing backup protocols that would function independently of normal electronic communications networks. Agent Williams received another urgent communication and immediately moved to Morrison's side. "Sir, we have confirmation that foreign intelligence operatives have been actively tracking Mrs. Chen's movements. We need to assume that her location and purpose here are already known to potentially hostile parties." Morrison's expression hardened with the realization that they were dealing with an active intelligence operation. "Mrs. Chen, we're going to need to move you to a secure facility immediately. The information you've brought us is too sensitive to remain in a public area." Margaret closed the Bible carefully and stood up with a dignity that commanded respect from everyone present. "Secretary Morrison, David prepared me for this possibility as well. He said that if foreign powers ever discovered the existence of these protocols, speed and secrecy would be essential to preventing them from being compromised or stolen." Morrison gestured toward the elevator where additional security personnel were now waiting. "Mrs. Chen, you have my personal guarantee that these protocols will be handled with the utmost security and used only to protect American interests." As they prepared to leave the visitor center, Margaret paused and looked back at Janet and Rodriguez. "Thank you both for eventually listening to what I had to say. David always told me that the most important battles are often fought by ordinary people in ordinary places who choose to do the right thing when it matters most." Janet wiped away tears that had gathered in her eyes. "Mrs. Chen, I promise that I'll never again dismiss someone just because their story seems impossible. Today taught me that truth can be stranger than fiction, and heroes don't always look the way we expect them to." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "Ma'am, your husband would be proud of the courage you showed today. It took incredible strength to carry that information alone for as long as you did." Margaret smiled one final time before joining Morrison and his security detail at the elevator. "David always said that service to country doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Sometimes the most important service happens years later, when you least expect it, carried out by people who never sought recognition or glory." The elevator doors closed, carrying Margaret Chen and her husband's Bible toward a secure facility where the protocols that had been hidden in plain sight for decades would finally fulfill their intended purpose. Behind them, Janet and Rodriguez were left to contemplate how close they'd come to missing one of the most significant intelligence breaches and security discoveries in American history. What none of them knew was that Margaret's story would eventually become a classified case study taught to intelligence analysts and security personnel throughout the government, a reminder that the most critical information sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, and that dismissing people based on appearances or preconceptions can have consequences that extend far beyond hurt feelings. The Bible that everyone had laughed at contained protocols that would revolutionize American nuclear security for the next generation, and the elderly woman they'd dismissed as delusional had just helped prevent what could have been the greatest intelligence disaster in U.S. military history. The secure facility beneath the Pentagon was a place most Americans would never see, a labyrinth of reinforced concrete corridors and blast-resistant chambers where the nation's most sensitive decisions were made. Margaret Chen found herself in Conference Room Alpha 7, a windowless space lined with copper mesh to prevent electronic eavesdropping, surrounded by some of the most powerful people in American national security. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the Pentagon's chief cryptographic analyst, sat across from Margaret with the Bible open between them, her dark eyes moving rapidly between the handwritten codes and her laptop screen. She'd been working for 3 hours to verify the authenticity of Colonel Chen's protocols, and her expression grew more amazed with each passing minute. "Mrs. Chen, these authentication sequences are absolutely brilliant. Your husband created a cryptographic system that's simultaneously completely independent of our current infrastructure and fully compatible with it." Margaret watched Dr. Martinez work with a mixture of pride and sadness. David spent countless nights at our kitchen table working on those calculations. I used to bring him coffee at 2 in the morning and find him surrounded by papers covered in numbers that looked like gibberish to me. General Patricia Hayes, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, leaned forward with intense interest. "Mrs. Chen, Dr. Martinez is telling us that your husband's backup protocols could function even if our entire primary command structure was destroyed or compromised. Is that your understanding as well?" Margaret nodded slowly, opening the Bible to a section filled with David's technical drawings. David called it nuclear command independence. He said that America's nuclear deterrent was only credible if it could function regardless of what happened to Washington, NORAD, or any other single point of failure. Admiral Robert Kim, head of Strategic Command, studied the diagrams with professional fascination. "Mrs. Chen, these backup communication systems your husband designed, they appear to use amateur radio frequencies and civilian satellite networks. That's unconventional but potentially genius." Margaret smiled at the memory this evoked. David was a ham radio operator before he joined the military. He always said that the most sophisticated enemies would focus on disrupting military and government communications, but they'd never think to monitor amateur radio operators in small towns across America. Dr. Martinez looked up from her laptop with excitement barely contained in her professional demeanor. "Mrs. Chen, I've run preliminary tests on the authentication algorithms, and they're not just functional. They're more secure than some of our current systems. Your husband was decades ahead of his time in terms of cryptographic security." CIA Director James Richardson, who'd been quietly observing the technical discussion, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Chen, our intelligence indicates that the foreign operatives who've been tracking you are part of a coordinated effort involving at least 3 different nations. They've been searching for Operation Sanctuary materials for over 2 years. Margaret's expression grew concerned. "Director Richardson, what does that mean for the security of these protocols now that we've brought them to light?" Richardson exchanged glances with Secretary Morrison before answering. "It means that simply possessing these protocols isn't enough. We need to implement them immediately and ensure that the backup systems are operational before our adversaries realize what we've recovered." General Hayes pulled out a secure tablet and began taking notes. "Mrs. Chen, implementing your husband's protocols will require coordination between multiple agencies and military branches. Are you prepared to work with our technical teams to ensure proper implementation?" Margaret straightened in her chair with a determination that surprised everyone present. "General Hayes, David spent 5 years teaching me how to read his technical notations and understand his security systems. He said that if this day ever came, I would need to be more than just a messenger. I would need to be his technical representative." Dr. Martinez paused in her analysis to stare at Margaret with new respect. "Mrs. Chen, are you saying that you actually understand the technical aspects of these protocols?" Margaret opened the Bible to a page covered with mathematical formulas and began explaining the calculations with a clarity that left the technical experts speechless. "This equation here calculates the optimal frequency rotation for secure communications under electronic warfare conditions. David taught me that you need to change transmission frequencies every 43 seconds to prevent enemy triangulation, but the sequence has to follow a pattern that authorized receivers can predict without revealing the algorithm to interceptors." Admiral Kim leaned back in his chair with amazement. "Mrs. Chen, you just explained a complex electronic warfare concept that most communications officers struggle to understand. Your husband taught you all of this?" Margaret nodded, her voice carrying the weight of years of patient learning. "David said that knowledge was too important to remain locked in one person's mind. He spent our retirement years making sure I understood every aspect of these protocols, not just their location and basic function." Secretary Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing appreciation for Colonel Chen's foresight. "Mrs. Chen, your husband essentially created a human backup system for the technical knowledge required to implement these protocols. That level of planning suggests he understood that the information alone wouldn't be sufficient. Margaret turned to another section of the Bible and revealed a detailed organizational chart showing how the backup protocols would integrate with existing military command structures. David called this the human element. He said that the most sophisticated technology in the world was worthless without people who understood how to use it properly and why it mattered. Director Richardson received an urgent message on his secure phone and immediately stepped away from the table to take the call. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Mrs. Chen, we have a time-sensitive situation. Our intelligence sources indicate that foreign operatives are planning to make contact with other Operation Sanctuary families, looking for additional protocol information." Margaret's face went pale. "Director Richardson, are you saying that other families might be in danger because of what I've revealed today?" General Hayes answered before Richardson could respond. "Mrs. Chen, the 12 officers involved in Operation Sanctuary were specifically chosen because they had demonstrated exceptional loyalty and discretion. It's possible that some of them left similar backup materials with their families." Dr. Martinez looked up from her analysis with urgency. "Mrs. Chen, if other families possess similar protocol information, we need to locate and secure those materials before hostile intelligence services do. Could your husband's documentation help us identify the other Operation Sanctuary participants?" Margaret flipped through the Bible until she found a page containing what appeared to be a list of names and locations written in David's careful handwriting. David maintained contact with several of his Operation Sanctuary colleagues throughout their retirement. He has notes here about their current status and family situations. Admiral Kim studied the list with professional interest. "Mrs. Chen, this information could help us protect other families while ensuring that all Operation Sanctuary materials are properly secured and integrated into current defense systems." Secretary Morrison stood up and began pacing the small conference room. "Mrs. Chen, we're facing a situation where your courage in bringing this information forward may have prevented a catastrophic security breach, but it's also created new urgencies that require immediate action." Margaret closed the Bible and held it against her chest with protective instincts. "Secretary Morrison, David always said that doing the right thing was rarely easy or convenient. He prepared me for the possibility that revealing these protocols might create complications as well as solutions." Director Richardson consulted his secure phone again before addressing the room. "Mrs. Chen, we have confirmation that foreign intelligence services have identified at least 3 other Operation Sanctuary families. We need to make contact with them immediately, both to ensure their safety and to secure any additional protocol materials they might possess." Dr. Martinez had continued her analysis throughout the discussion and now looked up with excitement. "Mrs. Chen, the protocols your husband created aren't just backup systems. They're actually improvements over our current infrastructure. Implementing them could strengthen our nuclear command capabilities, even under normal circumstances." General Hayes considered this revelation with strategic implications racing through her mind. "Mrs. Chen, if your husband's protocols represent genuine improvements to our current systems, implementing them becomes not just a security necessity but a strategic advantage." Margaret opened the Bible to a section containing detailed implementation timelines and resource requirements. David anticipated that possibility as well. He created different deployment scenarios depending on whether the protocols were being implemented as emergency backups or as systematic improvements to existing infrastructure. Admiral Kim examined the implementation plans with growing admiration for Colonel Chen's comprehensive planning. "Mrs. Chen, these deployment scenarios account for variables and contingencies that our current planning documents don't even address. Your husband thought of everything." Secretary Morrison stopped pacing and turned to face Margaret directly. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to understand that what you've accomplished today goes far beyond simply delivering important information. You've potentially changed the entire landscape of American nuclear security." Margaret met his gaze with quiet dignity. "Secretary Morrison, David always said that military service was about protecting something bigger than yourself. Today I finally understand what he meant." Director Richardson ended another secure phone call and addressed the room with urgency. "Mrs. Chen, we've successfully made contact with 2 other Operation Sanctuary families. Both confirm that they possess materials similar to what you've brought us, and both are willing to cooperate with our security teams." Dr. Martinez looked up from her final calculations with an expression of professional awe. Mrs. Chen, I've completed my analysis, and I can state with absolute certainty that your husband's protocols represent one of the most sophisticated backup command systems ever devised. Implementing them will significantly enhance our national security capabilities. General Hayes consulted her tablet and began coordinating implementation procedures. Mrs. Chen, based on Dr. Martinez's analysis and the strategic importance of these protocols, we're going to begin immediate implementation across all relevant command structures. Margaret stood up slowly, still holding the Bible that had caused so much confusion and dismissal just hours earlier. David would be proud to know that his work is finally serving its intended purpose. He spent 30 years of his life thinking about how to protect America, and he spent his retirement making sure that protection would survive even the worst-case scenarios. Admiral Kim rose to shake Margaret's hand with genuine respect. Mrs. Chen, your husband was a true patriot, and you've proven yourself to be cut from the same cloth. What you've done today will protect American lives for generations to come. Secretary Morrison approached Margaret with an expression that mixed gratitude with amazement. Mrs. Chen, when I walked into that visitor center this morning, I expected to be dealing with a routine security matter. Instead, I discovered that an elderly woman with a Bible was carrying the keys to revolutionizing American nuclear security. Margaret smiled with the satisfaction of a mission finally completed. Secretary Morrison, David always told me that the most important victories are often won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things when nobody's watching. Today, I finally got the chance to prove him right. Dr. Martinez closed her laptop and gathered her analysis materials. Mrs. Chen, implementing your husband's protocols will require ongoing technical consultation. Would you be willing to work with our teams to ensure proper deployment and maintenance of these systems? Margaret nodded with determination. Dr. Martinez, David spent 5 years preparing me for exactly that responsibility. I'm ready to serve my country in whatever capacity is needed. Director Richardson ended his final secure phone call and addressed Margaret with professional gratitude. Mrs. Chen, thanks to your courage and your husband's foresight, we've not only prevented a potential intelligence disaster but also acquired capabilities that will strengthen American security for decades to come. As the meeting concluded, and the various officials began coordinating the complex process of implementing Colonel Chen's protocols across multiple military and intelligence agencies, Margaret Chen sat quietly for a moment, holding the Bible that had been laughed at, dismissed, and ridiculed just that morning. The leather cover was worn smooth by decades of handling, first by David during his years of military service, and then by Margaret during the lonely months after his death, when she discovered the incredible responsibility he'd left in her care. The transformation was complete. The elderly woman with the impossible story had become the catalyst for one of the most significant advances in American nuclear security in decades, and the Bible that everyone had assumed was just another piece of religious memorabilia had revealed itself to be one of the most sophisticated backup command systems ever devised. 6 months later, the Pentagon Visitor Center looked exactly the same as it had on that October morning when Margaret Chen first walked through the automatic doors. The same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the same plastic chairs lined the waiting area, and Janet still sat behind the reception desk with her coffee mug and tired eyes. But everything had changed in ways that most visitors would never understand. Janet now kept a small, framed photograph on her desk, partially hidden behind her computer monitor, where only she could see it clearly. The photo showed Margaret Chen shaking hands with President Harrison at a classified ceremony in the White House, both women smiling as Margaret received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her contributions to national security. The citation, which would remain classified for decades, simply stated that Margaret Chen had provided critical intelligence that enhanced America's strategic defense capabilities. Rodriguez still worked the metal detectors, still checked identification cards, and still maintained security protocols with professional efficiency. But now he approached every visitor with a different mindset, one that recognized that extraordinary information could come from the most ordinary-looking people. He'd completed advanced training in recognizing potential intelligence assets and had been promoted to senior security specialist, a position that came with increased responsibility for identifying individuals who might possess sensitive information. The changes that Margaret's revelations had set in motion extended far beyond the Pentagon's visitor center. Operation Sanctuary protocols were now integrated into America's nuclear command structure at every level, creating redundant communication systems that could function independently of traditional military networks. Dr. Martinez had overseen the implementation process, working closely with Margaret to ensure that Colonel Chen's vision was realized exactly as he had intended. Margaret herself had undergone a transformation that surprised everyone who knew her. The quiet widow from Kansas had become one of the Pentagon's most valued technical consultants, working 3 days a week with teams of cryptographers and communications specialists to maintain and improve the systems her husband had designed. She'd moved to a secure apartment complex in Virginia, where she lived among other individuals with high-level security clearances, and she discovered a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt since David's death. The secure facility where Margaret now worked was located 10 floors beneath the Pentagon, accessible only through multiple layers of biometric security and armed checkpoints. Her office was small but comfortable, with a window that displayed a rotating selection of landscapes from around the world, though everyone understood that the window was actually a high-definition screen designed to prevent the psychological effects of working entirely underground. Dr. Martinez often found herself marveling at Margaret's technical capabilities, which had grown exponentially during the months of working with professional cryptographers and communications experts. Mrs. Chen, your understanding of adaptive frequency algorithms has progressed to the point where you're contributing original improvements to your husband's designs, she said during one of their regular review sessions. Margaret looked up from the technical manual she'd been studying, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. David always said that the best security systems were living documents that evolved with changing threats. He taught me to think of these protocols not as fixed instructions but as adaptive frameworks that could grow stronger over time. The Bible still sat on Margaret's desk, though it now resided in a climate-controlled case that preserved the delicate pages while allowing easy access to the information contained within. The worn leather cover had been carefully restored by specialists who understood that they were working with one of the most important intelligence documents in American history. Additional protocols and updates that David had hidden throughout the text continued to be discovered as analysts worked through every page with microscopic attention to detail. Admiral Kim visited Margaret's office regularly to discuss strategic implications of the backup systems that were now operational across the entire nuclear command structure. Mrs. Chen, the implementation of your husband's protocols has created communication redundancies that we didn't even know we needed, he said during one such visit. We've tested the systems under simulated attack conditions, and they perform flawlessly even when our primary networks are completely compromised. Margaret nodded with satisfaction, but her expression remained serious. Admiral Kim, David always warned me that the real test of these systems wouldn't come during simulations or exercises. He said that backup protocols only prove their worth when everything else has failed, and the stakes are genuinely life and death. The warning proved prescient sooner than anyone expected. On a cold February morning, cyber attackers launched a coordinated assault against multiple American military communication networks, temporarily disabling primary command systems at 3 major nuclear facilities. For 47 minutes, those installations relied entirely on Colonel Chen's backup protocols to maintain communication with Strategic Command Headquarters, and the systems performed exactly as David had designed them to. Margaret was in her underground office when the attack occurred, working with Dr. Martinez on routine protocol updates, when alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Within minutes, her phone was ringing with calls from military commanders reporting that backup systems were functioning perfectly, while primary networks struggled to resist the cyber assault. General Hayes arrived at Margaret's office while the attack was still ongoing, her expression mixing stress with amazement. Mrs. Chen, your husband's backup systems are currently handling nuclear command communications for 3 of our most critical installations. Without those protocols, we would have had a 30-minute window where those facilities were essentially cut off from strategic command. Margaret monitored the situation through secure terminals that displayed real-time status reports from the affected installations. The backup communication systems were operating exactly as David had intended, automatically switching between frequency bands and satellite networks to maintain constant contact with authorized command authorities. General Hayes, David designed these systems specifically for scenarios like this. He said that cyber warfare would eventually become the primary threat to nuclear command integrity. The cyber attack was eventually repelled by defensive systems and international cooperation, but the incident had profound implications for American strategic planning. Colonel Chen's backup protocols had prevented what could have been a catastrophic gap in nuclear command communications, and military leadership finally understood the true value of the systems that Margaret had brought to their attention. Director Richardson visited Margaret the day after the cyber attack, carrying a classified report that detailed how the backup protocols had performed during the crisis. "Mrs. Chen, your husband's systems didn't just function during yesterday's attack. They actually performed better than our primary networks. The adaptive frequency algorithms prevented the attackers from disrupting backup communications even after they'd successfully compromised our main systems." Margaret accepted the report with quiet pride, though her thoughts were focused on the broader implications of what had occurred. Director Richardson, David always said that America's enemies would eventually develop the capability to disrupt our electronic infrastructure. He spent years designing systems that could function independently of any single network or communication method. The success of the backup protocols during the cyber attack led to expanded implementation across additional military and intelligence agencies. Margaret found herself working with teams from the CIA, NSA, and Homeland Security, helping to adapt her husband's communication concepts for use in civilian infrastructure protection and intelligence operations. Secretary Morrison visited Margaret's office on the first anniversary of her arrival at the Pentagon, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing an expression of genuine gratitude. "Mrs. Chen, 1 year ago you walked into our visitor center with a Bible and a story that most people dismissed as impossible. Today you're one of our most valued technical advisors, and your husband's protocols are protecting American interests around the world." Margaret smiled as she accepted the champagne, though she noted that it would have to remain unopened in her secure office due to alcohol restrictions in classified facilities. "Secretary Morrison, David always told me that the most important work happens quietly, behind the scenes, done by people who never seek recognition or glory. This past year has taught me what he meant." The impact of Margaret's revelations extended beyond military and intelligence applications. Her story had become a classified case study taught to security personnel throughout the government, emphasizing the importance of listening to all sources of potential intelligence, regardless of how unlikely they might initially appear. Janet and Rodriguez had both become instructors in the training program, sharing their experiences of that October morning when they'd almost missed one of the most significant intelligence discoveries in recent history. Janet often spoke to new Pentagon security personnel about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearances. Mrs. Chen looked exactly like what she was, a 72-year-old widow from Kansas with a worn Bible and an impossible story. The problem was that we assumed we knew what that meant instead of listening to what she was actually telling us. Rodriguez's portion of the training focused on recognizing potential intelligence assets among ordinary visitors. Mrs. Chen displayed none of the behaviors we're trained to associate with people carrying sensitive information. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't evasive, and she wasn't trying to hide anything. She was just an elderly woman who wanted someone to take her seriously. The training program had already prevented several potential intelligence oversights, including incidents where family members of deceased military personnel had attempted to turn over sensitive materials to appropriate authorities, only to be dismissed by frontline security staff who failed to recognize the significance of what they were being offered. Margaret's work had also led to the establishment of the Chen Protocol Review Board, a classified committee responsible for identifying and evaluating potential backup intelligence systems that might have been created by other military personnel without official authorization. The board had discovered materials from 6 additional officers who had created unofficial backup systems for various classified programs, though none as comprehensive or sophisticated as what David Chen had developed. Dr. Martinez had become Margaret's closest colleague and friend during the months of working together, and she often marveled at the older woman's ability to absorb and apply complex technical concepts. "Mrs. Chen, you've progressed from understanding basic cryptographic principles to contributing original research that's advancing the field of secure communications. Your husband taught you well, but you've taken his knowledge and expanded it in ways he probably never imagined." Margaret looked up from the advanced mathematical formula she'd been reviewing, her expression thoughtful. "David always said that knowledge was meant to grow and evolve. He taught me the foundations, but working with all of you has helped me understand how those foundations could support structures he never envisioned." The Bible remains central to Margaret's work, not just as a historical artifact, but as a continuing source of technical information. David had apparently continued adding new protocols and updates to the margins and blank pages throughout his retirement, creating a comprehensive technical manual disguised as a religious text. Each new discovery revealed additional layers of his strategic thinking and technical innovation. Admiral Kim had commissioned a complete forensic analysis of the Bible by document specialists and cryptographic experts, resulting in a classified technical manual that was over 300 pages long, when all of David's annotations were compiled and explained. "Mrs. Chen, your husband essentially wrote a graduate-level textbook on backup communication systems and hid it in plain sight where no one would think to look for classified information." Margaret nodded with appreciation for her late husband's cleverness. David used to joke that the best way to hide secrets was to put them somewhere that people would see but not really look. He said that everyone owns a Bible, but very few people read it carefully enough to notice technical diagrams hidden among the verses. The success of Margaret's contributions to national security had earned her recognition at the highest levels of government, though most of the honors remained classified due to the sensitive nature of her work. President Harrison had personally thanked her during a private White House meeting, expressing his gratitude for her courage in bringing forward information that had strengthened America's strategic capabilities. Margaret had declined most opportunities for public recognition, preferring to continue her quiet work in the secure facilities beneath the Pentagon. She understood that David would have approved of her decision to remain focused on technical contributions rather than seeking celebrity or political advantage from her unique situation. The foreign intelligence services that had been tracking Margaret's activities had eventually been identified and neutralized through a combination of diplomatic pressure and counterintelligence operations. Director Richardson's teams had discovered that the coordinated effort to locate Operation Sanctuary materials had involved intelligence agencies from 3 different countries working together to identify and exploit potential vulnerabilities in American nuclear command systems. Margaret learned about the successful counterintelligence operations during a briefing that revealed how close foreign operatives had come to locating other Operation Sanctuary families before American security teams could protect them. "Mrs. Chen, your decision to bring this information forward when you did may have prevented our adversaries from acquiring backup nuclear protocols that they could have used to compromise American strategic capabilities." The revelation that foreign powers had been actively seeking to exploit Operation Sanctuary materials validated David's original concerns about the security of backup nuclear systems. His decision to hide the protocols in seemingly innocuous personal belongings had prevented their discovery by sophisticated intelligence operations that had been specifically searching for classified technical documents. Margaret's work had also led to improvements in how the government handled potentially sensitive information from civilian sources. New protocols required security personnel to escalate any claims involving classified programs or technical systems to specialists who were trained to evaluate the legitimacy of such information without dismissing sources based on appearances or initial impressions. The Pentagon Visitor Center now displayed a small plaque near the reception desk that read, "Listen with respect, evaluate with care, and remember that critical information can come from unexpected sources." Janet kept the plaque polished and prominent, serving as a daily reminder of the lessons she'd learned from her encounter with Margaret Chen. Rodriguez had been promoted twice since that October morning, eventually becoming the Pentagon's Chief of Visitor Security, a position that involved training other facilities in proper procedures for handling potential intelligence sources. His experience with Margaret had taught him that effective security required balancing appropriate caution with genuine openness to legitimate information sources. As Margaret sat in her underground office on the 2nd anniversary of her first visit to the Pentagon, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning, when she'd driven 14 hours from Kansas with nothing but her husband's Bible and an impossible story. The quiet retirement she'd expected after David's death had been replaced by a second career that was more challenging and rewarding than anything she'd experienced in her previous life. Dr. Martinez stopped by Margaret's office that afternoon, carrying a technical report that summarized the latest improvements to the Chen protocols. "Mrs. Chen, the adaptive algorithms you helped develop last month have been tested under simulated electromagnetic pulse conditions, and they performed even better than we'd hoped. Your husband's original framework continues to support innovations he couldn't have imagined." Margaret smiled as she reviewed the test results, noting how the systems had automatically compensated for theoretical communication disruptions by switching to backup frequencies and alternative transmission methods. David always said that the best security systems were the ones that could think for themselves when human operators were unavailable or incapacitated. The Bible sat in its climate-controlled case on Margaret's desk, its pages now completely cataloged and analyzed by the nation's top cryptographic experts. Yet Margaret continued to discover new insights and applications by studying David's technical annotations in combination with her growing understanding of advanced communication theory. Admiral Kim had recently commissioned a comprehensive study of how the Chen protocols could be adapted for use in space-based communication systems, recognizing that future conflicts might extend beyond Earth's atmosphere. Margaret's input had been crucial in developing specifications for satellite-based backup systems that could function independently of terrestrial infrastructure. Margaret often worked late into the evening, driven by the same sense of purpose that had motivated David during his years of military service. She understood that her husband's vision of truly secure backup communication systems was still evolving, and that her role was to ensure that his innovations continued to protect American interests for generations to come. The transformation from dismissed widow to valued intelligence asset had taught Margaret that the most important contributions often come from people who never expected to make them. Her story had become an inspiration to security personnel throughout the government, demonstrating that extraordinary discoveries could result from listening to ordinary people with extraordinary information. As she prepared to leave her office that evening, Margaret paused to look at the photograph on her desk, showing her and David on their wedding day, both young and full of dreams they couldn't have imagined, would eventually contribute to protecting their country in ways they never anticipated. The worn leather Bible that had started this journey sat nearby, still holding secrets that continued to strengthen America's security in an uncertain world. The automatic doors of the Pentagon Visitor Center continued to open and close for thousands of visitors each month, most of whom would never know that one elderly woman with a Bible had walked through those same doors and changed the course of American national security forever. But Janet and Rodriguez knew, and they made sure that every visitor was treated with the respect and attention that Margaret Chen had finally received after hours of being dismissed and ridiculed. Margaret Chen's story proved that heroes don't always look like what we expect, that critical intelligence can be hidden in the most unlikely places, and that listening with respect and evaluating with care can sometimes prevent disasters and discover opportunities that change everything. The Bible that everyone laughed at had indeed been full of nuclear activation codes, and the woman they dismissed had turned out to be one of the most important intelligence assets in modern American history. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.